Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I am Amar Malik, Senior Research Associate at the Center on International Development and Governance here at the Urban Institute. I want to first thank you all for joining us today, which is second time we're having a public discussion on women's economic empowerment. I think it is safe to say that women's economic participation and women's participation in all spheres of life is essential for achieving sustainable development. In recent years, we know the technological revolution has affected all of our lives in a multitude of ways, and it creates both barriers and opportunities for women to achieve the goal that I mentioned earlier. So in this regard, for example, technology can help a woman circumvent physical and social barriers to mobility and accessing jobs and make a livelihood. But on the other hand, we also know that about there's a 14% gap between men's and women's access to mobile phones around the world. And this gap increases to 50 or 60% in countries like India because of gaps in education and attainment and the cost of acquiring technology. In this regard, today's discussion will be an opportunity for us to discuss a few concrete examples of how these applications of technology can improve women's lives around the world. And we will also try to connect this to the broader international debate on women's economic empowerment and what this means for the future. So before I turn it over to the panel, I would also like to welcome our online audience. Many of you have joined us from around the world today, and we encourage everybody, both people who are here in person and those who are online, to participate in the conversation that you're hearing today by using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. At the end of this conversation that you will hear, we will also have time for questions and answers. So please either ask a question in person if you're here, or you can email your questions to events@urban.org. And someone will filter those questions up to the moderator. I would now also like to thank our two collaborators, the Overseas Development Institute of London and Canada's International Development Research Centre, who have helped us put this event together today. Much of Urban's work on women's economic empowerment is supported by the Growth and Economic Opportunities for Women initiative, which is a multi-funder partnership between the UK government's Department for International Development, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and Canada's IDRC. We are grateful to these and other funders who make possible our work. Today's panel will be moderated by Madiha Ahmed. She is a senior specialist at Canada's IDRC, where she leads the GROW initiative. Abigail joins us from the Overseas Development Institute, where she's a senior research officer and leads the institute's work on women's economic empowerment. Meera is an internationally recognized expert on gender and development. She is a senior fellow both at the Center for Economic Development here in DC and at the United Nations Foundation. Finally, Yasmin, my collaborator on our ongoing work on women's mobility and safety in public transit, who is a senior research associate at the Justice Policy Center here at Urban. With that, I'll turn it over to Madiha to begin this conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amar. So let's get right to it. We hear this a lot, that context matters, that, and I think Mary may have said this, that the nature and boundaries of women's economic participation is affected both by the local environment as well as by broader demographic trends and economic shifts. So for me, this is why this conversation today is so interesting. We've crossed by now a very critical halfway point. Currently, more than 55% of the population is in urban settlements. By 2030, that will be 60%. The knowledge economy and the skills to navigate it have become increasingly important. Labor-intensive, low-skilled manufacturing no longer remains the core of a lot of economies. And the dense structure of our cities makes non-transferable services core and central to the way that people work and engage in the economy. And yet, despite these broad global trends, we know that Lagos is very different from Lahore, and Lahore is very different from Sao Paulo. So today we have the opportunity to unpack both what we know about broad trends in globalization and in technology and how that intersects with women's economic empowerment, but also look at some very specific examples from ongoing research that can provide insight and learning. So I'm actually going to ask Myra to open up the discussion. And Myra, for you, what does economic empowerment mean to you? In fact, you talk about subjective empowerment. What does that refer to, and how do we measure it?
Yeah, sure. Subjective economic empowerment.
Subjective economic
Which
empowerment.
may be different from subjective empowerment. Let me just say, as a very practical researcher, I have evolved in my views of economic empowerment. When we did the roadmap, there's a publication that I did with the UN Foundation that is called A Women's Roadmap to Economic Empowerment. At that point, and that was in 2013, we had decided, I was trying to put together all these different pieces of evidence of literature that other people had done. So I had said, well, how do we define economic empowerment? And I just said, well, increases in productivity and earning, because those were the objective things we could measure. Even that is not very simple, because researchers don't usually measure increases in productivity and earnings. They may measure business growth or setting up a new business. But anyway, at that point I had said, trying to measure a subjective component is just going to be too difficult, too messy. We're not going to do it. And I was rightly criticized. And I remember Karen Groen being one that said, you have to acknowledge that economic empowerment is more than just these objective dimensions. And actually now, what we did last year, in 2016, what we did is we went back and we updated all the evidence of the Women's Economic Roadmap, looking at the new research that had come out. And it's really interesting, because the new research shows you that subjective economic empowerment is very important. And it's very important not only as a final outcome of an economic empowerment intervention of a credit or savings or whatever, but it's very important as an intermediate outcome. And it really improves final outcomes, improves productivity and earnings, particularly for those women who are less empowered in households. And there's a really interesting combination about what I call smart design and this subjective economic empowerment. And you give me just a minute to explain. Savings interventions. Savings is the one thing that seems to work in terms of increasing women's productivity and earnings. But savings, individual private savings, particularly those with a commitment device, with some kind of feature that tells you you're saving for a certain thing and you should keep this saving for a year before you spend it. So you have a commitment device, does two things to women in particular. First, the thought of thinking of private savings increases women's self-reliance and autonomy. And the second thing that it does, particularly for very poor women in villages, in rural areas, where they're socially taxed, and they have a lot of pressures when they have money to divest some of that money to give it away to the family or whatever. Commitment savings helps them, because then they keep the money in the savings accounts and they do not give it away to some other people, and then they invest it in business. So it also, these savings accounts, it increases women's self-reliance and autonomy, and it protects them. In a very funny way, it shelters them, it shields them from the usual pressures that they have in their villages, in their households. And all this empowers them, which is very interesting. And then, they have better outcomes at the end. So I have now decided, okay, yes, subjective economic empowerment is very important because it's important as a final outcome, and it's a very important intermediate outcome. The question is, how do you measure it? And there is where I think, there's still a lot of work to be done, because usually the typical measures that people have used are based on self-reporting. Self-reporting can be biased. But usually by now, sort of the better measures are some measures that get at the issue of autonomy, self-confidence, and maybe even sort of increases in risk-taking. Those are, I think, probably good proxies of economic empowerment. Something that may not be such a good proxy is what most people use to measure women's economic empowerment, is sort of changes in household decision-making. Because that may be another domain of empowerment that may not be that directly related to economic empowerment and what women are doing as individuals in their businesses. Okay. So that my final point is that researchers, in this sense, they're careless. They measure women's empowerment. They sort of all these randomized controlled trials. At the end, they will measure women's empowerment. They will measure it through decision making, but they don't really specify what kind of empowerment they're talking about. And we should not assume that empowerment in one domain of women's lives necessarily transfers to other domains. So I think that we have to be a lot more rigorous and smart about the way that we measure economic empowerment.
Thank you, Mara. That's very interesting. And I think you've helped start us off well, because we want to talk a little bit more about how technology intersects with women's economic empowerment. And I think your example of the savings app in particular is a nice way of technology, but also looking at how that behavior changes as a result of the use of technology. And I think here I want to bring in Abigail, because your work on this, on the growing on-demand economy for domestic work, I think your research quotes something that of the 67 million workers in the domestic economy, 80% are women. How much does urbanization and new technological platforms affect women's pathway to economic empowerment?
Yeah, thanks. Let me just say a few words about the research that we were doing for the folks here. So we, last year, and previously to my arrival at ODI last year, had been doing work for a number of years on women's economic empowerment broadly. And last year we did a bit of a trend scoping. We wanted to look at what's happening in the world of work that is affecting women's engagement in the labour market and their economic empowerment outcomes. And one of the things that we identified was the role of technology in mediating women's access to economic opportunities. And one of the things that we saw as with the USA and, for example, over in Europe, is this Uberization of work. So this is where technology-focused companies are setting up mobile apps or different kind of platforms to link workers with the purchasers of their services. And we found that similarly in emerging economies, similar kind of platform models were also emerging, including in sectors where women are traditionally overrepresented, such as the domestic work sector, which we focus down on. And we very quickly realized that this is very new and emerging, and there's very little analysis to date has been done on this, particularly in developing, or we might say emerging economy countries. There's a certain amount of evidence on the USA and Europe, but it's not gendered, and it's a focus on USA and Europe, where a lot of the conversation has been around very formal sectors, such as the transport sector in the case of Uber, and the implications for regularization and a slip in working conditions. We wanted to take the opposite view and say, okay, well, many of the sectors where this is emerging, such as the domestic work sector, are already highly informal and precarious. And women are overrepresented in them, so what does this mean? That was our starting point. And I think the really key thing that I would also like to say is that this was very preliminary research. As I said, there's not really been any evidence done in this because it's very, evidence collection done in this because it's very new and emerging. So we looked at the emergence of these kind of Uber-style platforms for domestic work in a number of countries. We looked quite in depth at South Africa. We looked at India, Mexico, and Kenya as well, for example. And in terms of urbanization, well, I think it's quite clear. I mean, this is really an urban phenomena. For the moment, the service purchasers, the households that are purchasing domestic work services, are located in urban areas. I don't think that's much different globally when it comes to the gig or on-demand economy. However, what we also found, which I thought was quite interesting, is that many of the companies, particularly in the countries that we looked at, were actually reaching out to rural areas to recruit the workers. And they were using a number of means to do this, because whilst many of us may be familiar with the technology, both the service purchaser, the household, and the worker going through the mobile phone app, actually what we found that in very low-tech environments, the companies that were engaging with the service purchasers through the app, you know, who were going on, they were ordering their service, but they were actually using a lot more innovative and locally relevant means to recruit the workers who may not have been online. So they were, for example, going out to rural villages, they were recruiting by word of mouth, they were doing kind of advertising, even on, you know, things like buses or in local villages with their posters to recruit the workers, who were then in many cases traveling into the urban areas to engage in the work. And this was certainly the case for internal migration. For example, in India, we saw a lot of these kind of publicity campaigns for recruiting workers. Interestingly, what we saw in South Africa was that there was really an international dimension to this, where workers in surrounding countries, including, for example, Zimbabwe, were going on the apps, and then they were traveling into urban areas such as Cape Town to actually carry out the work. What's quite interesting about this is that, you know, traditionally the domestic work sector has been recruited through word of mouth, through established networks. And what we found was that the technology itself enabled workers to access economic opportunities even when they didn't have these networks. So that's quite interesting when you're thinking about women's access to economic opportunities. I think, so in terms of change, that's definitely one example there of where we've seen the technology has a role in reconfiguring some of the experiences of women in engaging with the labour market. But what I would also just highlight, because I think this is also really critical, is that there were many things that actually the technology just demonstrated a new manifestation of existing challenges within the domestic work sector. Notably, we found that in many cases, the technology was actually just replicating many of the very uneven power relations and inequalities within the sector, both between the different groups of women who are engaging as domestic workers, but also between the households who are purchasing their services and the workers. So if I might just give an example. So many of the platforms, as you may be familiar with, work through worker profiles on the site. And, you know, we found some evidence, just please bear in mind that this was a very preliminary study and we want to do more on this, but the evidence we found was that a lot of the workers, as in the traditional sector, were experiencing a number of different kinds of abuse, or even the way that they were selected by households has often been done on very different lines, for example, along race lines, gender lines, age lines, etc. And we found quite simply that this was replicated through the profiles, because all of the ability to choose who does the worker is with the household. And when the platform profiles have photos, they have demographic information that goes way beyond the aptitudes, for want of a better word, of that worker for the task in hand, we can say that actually, again, the households are selecting based on many of the same kind of personal characteristics of workers. I'll just give a second example of where we're seeing the technology is replicating existing challenges was around the rating systems. So once a worker has been to the household, they're being rated by a star rating or you know, another, depending on the platform, another kind of rating about the quality of the service. But there, as with elsewhere in the gig economy, I think there's a great challenge about either conscious or unconscious bias on the part of the person who's rating the household service, where actually it might not be because of the standard of the service, because of the standard of the domestic service that workers might get rated down on. It might be because actually there's discriminatory forces and prejudices at play, which mean that workers are receiving lower ratings. I think there's a lot more to be done on this, but certainly our findings corroborate the evidence from the wider gig economy that this is the case.
Thank you. I think later in the conversation we'll definitely come back to the unintended consequences. I did want to move to Yasmin because I think it'd be really interesting to talk a little bit about, again, talking about marginalization or discrimination, access to public spaces or mobility. And again, in growing urbanization, we know women use infrastructure differently from men, or their marginalized populations who might use it differently. How can you walk us through examples where technology can be used to improve such access to public services, or in places where it's actually done worse, or again?
Sure. It's increasingly important to start thinking about like how can we develop new technology, or how can we start using the existing technology to respond to the needs of women. But before thinking about that, or before kind of trying to understand the relationship between this economic empowerment and technology, as Myra was saying about it, like we should critically think about what does economic empowerment mean and what does technology mean. So economic empowerment, as Myra was saying, is a process, and it's a very, very complex one. So we are talking about the interplay between different social systems, and technology is like, I'm going to try to give the basic definition of it. Like, it's basically our knowledge about the techniques to produce something, to solve a very discrete problem, and to achieve very concrete goals. So when you think about something like women's empowerment, which is like quite complex, and when you try to apply technology to it, technology can only basically provide us the means to solve very concrete problems, or to basically to overcome very narrow challenges. So in our study with Amar, for instance, like we are doing this study in Pakistan, and this fall we're going to be exploring how women's fear of sexual harassment impact their access to public transit systems in Lahore. And the thing is, like, you can start thinking about like if technology can answer the fear problem for women. The quite short answer is technology cannot resolve the fear of women in their access to public transit. What it can provide us is that as we are having these challenges to respond to this problem, it can provide us the means in our efforts to make public transit accessible to women. And to give you, as you were talking about, a couple of examples. I mean, I'm a criminalist myself. I know, for instance, like the use of CCTVs and everything. And we don't have quite many studies about, we have a couple of RCTs and everything. But when you look at the effect of CCTV, for instance, we know that CCTVs do not work in reducing women's fear of crime if the man's behavior in front of the camera doesn't change. And another example of it, like for instance, if we're not talking about like technology per se, but if we're talking about different modalities of transportation, the women-only modes of transportation, we know that they are reducing the fear of crime among women. But again, we are removing the man factor there. So basically, and one of the most important things for me, like considering our study, for instance, United Nations have these evaluations in a different field about women's access to the energy sector, solar power and everything. And they have shown that when women are provided the opportunity to provide information on certain things over mobile technology, they're feeling much more autonomous. And that anonymity that comes from not having the ear of a person, like your husband, your coworker, is making people to be, I'm going to say the word, more maybe honest, to come forward about providing this kind of information. So when we are talking in terms of like the issue of sexual harassment is notoriously underreported. It's not just about Pakistan, it's in any country basically. And if we are talking about the fear of crime, the traditional ways of measuring fear of crime are not that reliable because they rely on people's own memories of feelings that have happened, months before, for instance. So basically, by using mobile app technology to capture that, fear of crime in real time, or maybe in near real time, we are going to be hopefully able to capture what triggers both men's and women's fear in their whole journey from one point to another. I think that's the missing piece out there. And this is just like one example of how technology can be used towards women's economic empowerment. And this is my, I think, like conclusion point about this. Like each of these applications are solving very concrete, narrow problems. But I guess if we think all of them in all together, I'm hoping that they're going to be able to provide a meaningful systematic change in the long term altogether.
Thank you. In fact, I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier on this, the interplay between different social systems, and actually talk about caregiving. I mean, again, the distribution of work on care, it falls mostly to women. So when we're looking at transportation infrastructure, because caregiving responsibilities affects the way that transport is used. It's, the timing is different, it's not point A to point B, it's more circular. Has this been configured into the way we think of transportation infrastructure? Are they good examples? Are they bad examples?
I mean, I think from the perspective of, there are a couple of things we have to first state. Like we already know certain facts like women's travel patterns are much more complex than men's. Their travel time is much more longer than women's. And even if we are talking within like groups of women, we know that women living in the rural areas are much more, prone to the effects of the negative effects of transportation or the lack of transportation or, the capacity of transportation than the women living in the urban areas. I think the problem about is that yes, we have crazy amounts of investment in transportation structures, but when we are doing them, we are not thinking particularly with regards to the needs of people living in the rural areas versus the urban areas. And the connection between, the big picture is that we know that women are multitasking. We know that women in both rural and urban areas are multitasking, but we are not particularly responding to the needs of these women in rural areas. I guess that's my answer, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you know of any work ongoing that's looking at this yet, or is this something for a future agenda?
I mean, I think that should be something for the future agenda. Like if we are thinking about, especially getting that information through mobile apps, as Amar was talking about it at the beginning, although we can say that the mobile phone penetration is like 3/4 of the world, in Pakistan, for example, 81% of men have access to mobile phones versus I think it's like 67% of women. So that big picture of 3/4 of population doesn't make sense when you go into the details of it. So I'm imagining, for instance, if you want to learn about these experiences of women through mobile applications, myself as a researcher, I'm not going to be capturing every woman's
experience. That's
yes.
Good. Mara, staying on this topic, your work actually has looked at very much, as you say, what has proven to work, how affordable, accessible childcare in the workplace and community, provided either through the employers or state-funded programs, can actually be really important for improving women's employment and earning potential. Can you speak to us a little bit about that, what you've seen, what has worked, or where things we should be careful about?
Sure, and I will tell you the story of Chile. Chile did two things, two different interventions. Both, I think, were the first one. I think was during the first period of Bachelet's government, Michelle Bachelet, and what the policy there was, they required employers that had more than 20 women workers had to establish childcare in the factory or in the firm, whatever. And then, these researchers, I think from the University of Chile, went in to see the effect of the policy. And what they did, and it's a really interesting design, they took factories and firms that had 19 employers. So they didn't have to abide by the policy, and those that had 20. And they measure the impact on recent hires, the first, women just hired. And what had happened is that in the factories and the firms with more than 20 employees, the young women who entered in their first entry jobs got paid less than in the other firms. So basically what had happened is the employers had followed the law, had put in the childcare center, and had transferred the cost of the childcare center to the woman employee, with the incredibly perverse effect that the gender gap in wages had widened even more so, because now women were being paid less because of the childcare. So that clearly is the kind of policy that does not work. You can legislate, as much as you want, but if you don't realize and if you don't anticipate the perverse consequences of such a policy, you're going to be hurting women instead of helping them. So then the government of Chile, I think, wisened up, if that's the expression. And what they did, and now this is in this government, what they have done, is they have extended the day of the school day. So, but schooling is public schooling is paid by the state. So they have extended the school day, and this has led to an increase in labor force participation of women. So, the bottom line, childcare is something that is so important for society that should be socialized, and the state should finance childcare. It doesn't mean that it has to provide childcare, but it should be the major financer of childcare, because the benefits, there are huge economic as well as social benefits for society. And there are ways of doing, and childcare does not only mean establishing childcare centers. You can do things like extending school day, and that really does work.
We're actually
Let me just mention something, I think, on what Jasmine was saying. I mean, the really interesting thing of these apps and technology and how they really overcome, however narrow the barriers that they overcome, there's sometimes really important barriers, because, in the case of Abigail, to suddenly have women in rural areas know about job opportunities without having to go through networks, that is huge. As it is, with the mobile phones for savings, for financial transactions. Suddenly, you have a private way that nobody else, that your husband or your family will know. So suddenly you gain in autonomy only by having this mobile phone. And there's this incredibly, really interesting research that Shainer did in Kenya, where the financial transactions were in a card, and the card, an ATM card, where the husband and the wife had access to the card. The women never used the card. So privacy is very important.
And I want to kind of add to that, if I may. Like Amar, I'm going to be giving a teaser of our refugee work as well. Amar and I, we are doing this social network analysis of refugees in Turkey, Kenya, and Pakistan. And our report didn't come out yet, but one of the things that we found from our analysis is that we are looking at this egocentric networks of refugees, how they use their networks in like finding opportunities for employment and also housing when they arrived in the host country and everything. And we found that even when you control for the social network size and other demographic characteristics, the two things that popped up as one of the most important things with regards to their employment and income was their access to motorized vehicles and also their access to smart devices. So this is like, I know this is an panel about, we're talking about women, but there are like multiple vulnerable populations that we should be thinking about, and these type of apps can apply to.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I do want to come back to this issue of privacy, access to information, and how it can be transformative. But before that, I think I want to just one more question around care. And I think, Abigail, in your work, what's interesting is, given these shifts in pattern and the way the economy, the way jobs work, how has caregiving shifted? How has that shifted either does the burden remain with households, or does that even within households? How does that change? Have you seen anything in your work to give us some insights?
Yeah, in short. So I think the first thing to say is that we have to think about how these on-demand gig economy apps come to be, because technology has spied that you know, there are there's three. We saw it as a triangle. First of all, you've got the technology company here, and then you've got the two groups that it's linking: the service purchaser, you know, in our case, the household purchasing the domestic work service, and the worker themselves. Now, you know, you have to question, in terms of domestic work, and there's a bit of a blurry line there in terms of the actual task that's being done. In some cases, it certainly does move into the realms of care, whether it's childcare or elderly care that these workers are doing. You know, and so you can say for the service purchaser, for the household, this is another, slightly more modern, we might say, market-based approach to balancing unpaid care and domestic work. And we spoke to some service purchasers, and they said, absolutely, you know, I don't necessarily need a full-time maid, but it suits me to be, you know, at the touch of a button, able to go in and have a service at my door very easily, at short notice in some cases, you know, which suits my wish to balance my unpaid care and often my professional life. Because, of course, the service purchasers are in many cases this kind of emerging tech-savvy middle class that are emerging in developing countries, and that's why the gig economy is growing. So from that side, we can see that, yes, you know, I think some of the households are using these kind of apps to manage their own, particularly the women, of course, the unpaid care and domestic workload. For the workers, however, I think that's a slightly different and more challenging question. You know, the question remains is, you know, what happens to their unpaid care load and domestic workload? And here, frankly, I think more evidence is needed. So when we were doing this work, you know, we did quite a wide-ranging literature review, as well as our own empirical work. And one of the things that came through really clearly was this idea that the gig economy is absolutely fantastic for women workers because it enables them to balance their unpaid care and domestic work. In some cases in the literature it even says responsibilities, which is quite problematic in terms of the gendered implications of who is doing that in the household. But even still, you know, it's saying that this is absolutely fantastic, and the solution is that because it's work that is divided up into portions and women can log onto the app and seek that work when they want to, that this is absolutely fantastic as an ad hoc, flexible working pattern that suits women to arrange their paid work life around their unpaid care loads and domestic work. To cut a long story short, we think there are, off the basis of our own research so far, we think this is quite a problematic assumption in terms of the realities of why women are engaging in this kind of work, their preferences around engagement in the paid labour market, and what it means for their own unpaid care and domestic work. In short, the evidence isn't there yet, but we, funnily enough, that the next project we're going to do over the next year is going to be looking at exactly this question. You know, to what extent is it really enabling women to balance paid and unpaid care, paid and unpaid work in a way that they would like to do?
So, some of the work around women in formal labor market wage work as opposed to in flexible but low paid and not necessarily good condition work showcase that when you're balancing responsibilities, you get pushed into the low paid flexible work. And I wonder, these apps or this sort of technology, as you say, might be great for middle class or particular section, but further entrenches the inequities or shifts the burden, because we've seen this in other cases as well, whether it's migration, etc., from the rich to the middle class, from the middle class to the poor within households, from older women to younger girls left out of schools, you know, how that works. I know, Mara, you did some work about how when you're looking at women's economic empowerment interventions, you look at the evidence differently, whether you're looking at wage work versus entrepreneurs, and how targeting is really important when you're thinking about getting results. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
But let me tell you something first. It's not the apps that discriminate.
That's a good point. People behind that.
Yeah, don't blame the apps. Blame the people who use the apps. Let me just say and put a plug in here for a blog that Tanvi, actually, Yaluka, and I have just written on the CGD website that sort of talks about what I think we see as like the new challenges and the new frontiers in terms of research and action on women's economic empowerment, and it very much goes back to your introductory statement, how we have to really now, be much more aware of the context and that things vary, and that, unfortunately, there are no recipes that are going to be applicable, or very few things that are going to be applicable worldwide without regarding to who is the subject of the intervention or who's the client and the context. In terms of who is the client, I mean, there are obvious things that vary. I mean, first, in terms of just, project interventions that seek to empower women economically, which it's pretty obvious, but, the very poor need more. If you're very poor, just a single intervention will make no difference. For instance, savings, that is the one thing that really does works for most people, except there's just a very recent study, except for very poor rural women. The very poor who are, have no have just very basic constraints in terms of access to money or access to transport. So that's one thing. The second thing is, for the very poor things to work, but it has to be a bundle of interventions. They are more expensive, but they can be cost effective. So, you have to target women according to their income levels to begin with. Second, young women is very interesting, and think sometimes, particularly in urban areas, programs, training programs, vocational training programs, skills programs, work better for young women and not for older women. And I think it's just because younger women have fewer constraints, maybe. I don't know what's going on, but there's a history, a stream of very well research evaluated interventions in labor markets in Latin America for young people, and these interventions work. They work very well for young women. They even work better for young women than for young men, because probably young women are at a lower stage to begin with, and probably because men, regardless of the intervention, have more employment options. But anyway, these similar interventions have been used also, like in urban contexts, and with unemployment contexts with adult women, and there's a lot of interventions in the ECA region, and they don't work as well for older people. So age does matter. The geographical location, obviously things for urban women don't work for rural women and vice versa. Childcare interventions, I have yet to see good childcare interventions in rural areas for entrepreneurs. I mean, childcare works in the formal sector for wage workers, for salaried workers. It's very difficult, I think, to make it. And then for informal sector workers, for entrepreneurs, maybe we are starting to think of designing these type of childcare interventions, but it is difficult. Finally, and I think that's what our blog is saying, countries are in very different stages of the demographic transition, stages of urbanization, formalization of the economies, and you have to take those things into account. I mean, you cannot design employment programs for women without the awareness that these are very, very different urban environments.
So let me take that forward-looking lens a little bit further and actually ask you, in fact, maybe Yasmin, you can start us off with that. What would be our aspirations for a 21st century city that enables women's economic empowerment? Maybe something, what works?
What works? I think it's not about what works, but it's more about who will engage to try to understand what works. That's my, at least that's my interest in our project. Like, I feel like in my ideal 21st century city, it should strive to understand the needs of the most vulnerable. That's the problem. And I'm, again, here not just talking about women, there are going to be different groups of vulnerable people. And I think, like, I'm seeing, like, from these applications, whether it's about crime victimization, fear, and other things, like, these are most of the time used to communicate very useful information to people, to provide information to government. But with regards to, like, you know, when we have the interventions, we are not getting as much input from the users of these interventions, or the people that are most in need about what they need and what these people see as the most necessary changes in these things. So in my ideal 21st century city, we will pay attention to what people need, yeah.
What do you, if I could ask you to expand on that, when you say who we engage with, what do you mean by that?
I mean, for instance, like when you think about, again, I'm going to give examples from the transportation. Like, we know we are labeling things like women-only transportation as promising practices, right? So I know that there are a couple of studies looking at, like, in Mexico, as I said, like, we know that this reduces the fear of crime. But we are not asking the stakeholders, which is like you have a multi-stakeholder situation there where you're talking about the city service providers like law enforcement, transportation planners, engineers themselves, and the users of that service. And we are not getting you know, the feedback from the users of those service, those stakeholders, to reflect upon what are the best ways to change things and how people feel about those changes. Yeah.
I'm actually going to extend that question to Abigail as well. Aspirations for a 21st century city. And is there something from your research finding that's actually surprised you, that influences how you think about what the future should look like or what we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's about locally relevant approaches. And for me, it's about looking where women are now and looking at their realities where they are now, as opposed to thinking of kind of ideal type scenarios and what, you know, kind of imposing solutions to fit ideal type scenarios. I think, you know, for me, I always think of women in the informal economy when I think of this, because the reality is that many women, particularly in large urban areas, are in the informal economy. Whether it's in domestic work, for example, whether it's waste picking, market traders, street vendors. And what we see many times in public policy response is to kind of deny the reality of the women as it is. You know, we've only got to see, for example, the movement of women street traders out of the kind of overnight, in some cases, clearances of street traders away from where they are, which often they're in the place they are because it's where they're able to make money, because that's where their purchasers are, or because, for example, it's near to where they need to be for mobility questions. You know, and kind of initiatives that relocate women's market sites or street vending sites to another place. It isn't looking at where women are now and their realities and why they are where they are. So I think that's a great challenge. In terms of our own work, I mean, we've seen some interesting examples about where these technology companies have adapted to local realities. I'll give a concrete example. So in India, we know that women's access to mobile technology is very low in some cases, either because the infrastructure isn't there, because the affordability of the mobile technology isn't there, or of course because of questions such as literacy and actually being able to use slightly more advanced handsets, or the gender norms around in the household who gets to have ownership and use of a handset. And some of the companies have actually recognized these barriers, these gendered barriers to technology, to the mobile technology use. And so they've come up with some quite innovative solutions. So in some cases, one of the companies said that they will set up what they were calling camps in slum and low-income areas, where they physically would go out and they would set up a stall with the company name, and they would take down the roster of the women. They would have them on the database, and then when orders came in from the households, they would not necessarily be contacting the woman through a smartphone for many of the reasons I've just mentioned, but they would be contacting them through lower tech means. So, for example, instead of an order coming in through an app, there would be a phone call or sometimes to a family member who owns the technology. Now, on the one hand, you could say, what a fantastic way to try and include women in this gig economy. On the other hand, I think there's some questions around that as to why are they, some of these companies approaching these women. In many cases, I think the indications are because many of these women, we don't have enough time to talk about the reason now, but many of these women are the ones who will frankly work for a much lower wage, and therefore the service is cheaper, so therefore the company benefits. And I think there's a lot of unanswered questions around that. But I think it's clear that the companies are aware of the context they're operating in, and they're making steps to reach out to women, enable them to engage with the service, but it's not always in ways that are intended to benefit women's economic outcomes directly.
Very interesting. Mara, I am conscious of time, so we'll be moving to the open Q&A, but I wonder if you want to take a stab at that last question.
Sure, just yes, and very brief, but I think, the informality of women's work is really what is going to become the work of the future.
Yeah.
Jobs in the future are going to be much more like the kinds of jobs that women have done up to now in the informal sector. So I think that we have to think through how to structure the system of jobs that they have these advantageous features that apply to women and that attract women to the jobs, but that provide the social security and the benefits that the informal sector has not had. But I think that's where jobs are going in the future. So I think there's a lot that can be done also sort of to look at how women have handled jobs up to now in these informal sectors and lessons learned to structure jobs in the future.
And I'm going to add something, if I may. And as we are talking about this, I realized, when I was talking about stakeholders, one of the things that, you have all of this technology where you are able to get this information from users of different services. But the thing is, it's really important to try to find ways where that information can be used by the other stakeholders we're talking about. In that particular sense, I want to be conscious about the time, but we were lucky to engage with the Punjab Technology Board. And the thing is, right now we have, for instance, the right environment where they are already very, straightforward and acknowledging the importance of technology. And so this is the right time for us to basically reach out to them, to inform them about what we are doing and also learn about what they are doing. So we had these multiple engagements with them where we kind of prioritized letting them know about what we are doing to make sure that when we have the results, that can mean something to them. So I think that's a very important thing to think about. You can collect as much data as you want, but if you don't do anything upon it, so we are basically going back to the starting point where we are making the mistake of not recognizing the needs of the people. Yeah.
That's a good point. Timing matters. Saying that, because we want this to be as interactive as possible, although I found this extremely, extremely interesting, I think we'll shift, if the panelists allow me, to the open Q&A. We'll be taking questions both from the floor and from online. I think for those of us joining us online, just remember to email us, and we will have your questions asked. Just introduce yourselves, where you're from, and then tell us your question. And
thank you very much. My name is Cornelia Weiss, and I'm very glad that you said that technology is simply a means. And I want to go to the Chile example with regard to extending the school day and that child care should be a state function in terms of increasing labor participation. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask your opinion and your thoughts in terms of something that happened in Europe when West Germany absorbed East Germany, because there, East Germany, there was all-day school day, plus there was state-provided childcare. Now, when West Germany absorbed East Germany, West Germany has a half-day school day and not state-supported childcare. So the agreement was that there would be about a year provided of state-sponsored childcare, and then that went away. So the effect of that was increased poverty for German women. And yet, we're going ahead, but I think we also need to look back and we need to look at current, and how does that factor into this conversation? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take a set of questions before we open that up. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for hosting today. My name is Katrina Kinsolving. I'm from Plan International USA. My question is for Abigail. In your work, and I know it's kind of preliminary so far, I'm wondering about the recruitment that you were talking about, what that looks like. Is there a middle person who's going between having access to the app and going to these rural areas and sourcing a lot of these women to come in? Are there abuses, exploitation by these kind of recruiters, so on and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. My name is Tanya Delima, and I'm a social development specialist at the World Bank. I actually work on women's economic empowerment in Pakistan, so this was incredibly enlightening. I was wondering about everyone's take on kind of thinking of technology more neutrally, not only as a source for good, but possibly, as some of you have mentioned, a source for reinforcing already existing inequalities, and specifically in tech-enabled jobs, where in our work we've seen women typically take the lower-end part-time jobs in tech work and don't have a career ladder, whereas men can start at the bottom doing micro work and slowly move up to be a software developer, and there is that path open. And second, because I also work on gender-based violence, if you've seen anything on tech as an enabler of violence, because women having access to cell phones, women expressing themselves online, taking pictures, is all breaking cultural norms, and it's all moving a little too fast. And if you're seeing an increase in violence, or if you're seeing different strategies to combat that at all. So 2 questions.
Thank you. I think we'll start from Abigail, whichever one of these questions.
Yeah, recruitment. So we did speak to the founders of a couple of these companies. Let me give the example of one in Kenya, because I think it shows the kind of journey that some of these companies go through. They started off, as may be expected, as a very small enterprise. This is the platform company. And in the beginning, it was very manual. So they had an office, and they launched the app where the customer, as I say, the service purchaser, would go on the app and send an order. That would come through to a kind of call center in the office. And in parallel to that, the company, yes, they would have been going out and recruiting workers, in many cases face-to-face, including in villages or in local areas, or asking existing workers on the roster to recommend their friends, which was apparently quite a tried and tested method of bringing workers to the platform. They would have a kind of database of workers, and then when an order came in electronically to the centre, the people in the centre would look at the preferences. And this is quite an interesting point, because when the order came in, the household could specify the profile of the person they wanted. So would it be a young person? Would it be an old person? Would it be a woman? In many cases, it was a woman that they specified, except for many cases, the drivers and the cooks, quite interestingly, were often men, again, replicating what we already know from the domestic services sector. And then a manual kind of process would have been done to match up the request with a worker who would then be called, can you go? And then if they could, they would be dispatched. What they realized quite quickly is that this was a huge human resources drain. And what they wanted to do was move towards developing an algorithm for the automatic matching. So over time, that's what they did. So they managed to kind of test out the system. They tested out the customer preferences, the kind of time it would take for the service to be provided. And then they moved towards an algorithm quite slowly. In the end, I think they're in a kind of half and half situation now, where how do we say, households that have previously used the service would go more through the algorithm, but new customers, it would kind of be double-checked by the back office. And I think this is quite an interesting point for a number of reasons, because when it comes to the gig economy, that part of the, you know, the selling point is that these are really cheap, rock bottom prices for the service purchaser. And of course, if you're having an office with staff that are doing the manual matching, there's a cost implication in there for the cost of the service, which is added on for the commission that's taken by the company. And so when we see, for example, the things that I mentioned earlier, such as the rating systems on the platform, what they're actually doing is outsourcing the HR and the management and the ratings in this selection process to the service purchaser, which, as I mentioned, is problematic in itself in a number of ways. But a lot of the companies, that's what they want to do, is move towards an entirely automated system, which in countries which are more technologically advanced, you know, such as our own in USA and Europe, is very possible. Once you've gone past beta mode and you've actually got the coding right, that's possible because people are savvy about using the tech. In a lot of the contexts that we're talking about, it's very problematic because of the for the companies in terms of scale up, because, you know, if they want to compete with their competitors, you know, they want many people to be using the service, and on economy of scale to be able to provide the service at a cheap rate. You know, these things work on numbers. They want the vast pool of workers ready at the touch of a button, and they want more customers. So many of the contexts that we've been looking for, that is a challenge to full kind of automation of the service. That's the example from Kenya. I'm happy to speak afterwards about others.
Yasmin, maybe you want to take the violence and online.
I mean, the very same thing that makes people comfortable about sharing information with the anonymity, in fact, increases the risks for women being exposed to all forms of sexual exploitation. Like, sexual exploitation become a real legal term. The California State Attorney General Office defined this term sexual exploitation to refer to, you might have heard it as like revenge porn or, you know, doxing or whatever. Like, there are certain ways, it's not just about women. Every type of crime you can think about with the use of mobile technologies and internet, it started kind of turning into cyber offenses. And particularly, yes, women are really increasingly being more affected by it, like from, you know, the recent example of the Marines and everything like that. Anonymity is something that we need to really very carefully think about. And also things like sexual exploitation of children. Now we have the cyber sexual exploitation of children as a, you know, a very big main problem. And another thing we can think about, like we're talking about all these apps and stuff, collecting real-time information through these apps, and not thinking very carefully about how we're going to be using those apps might also put women under risk as well. So, yeah. Thank you.
Mara, perhaps a response on learning from history and also women being pushed into the lower end of the scale in certain positions as well.
On the East Germany, I mean, more generally, you know, in the former Soviet Union countries, the transition from a centralized economy to a market economy had led to very high unemployment rates, and particularly among women. So yes, and you know, one of the reasons is suddenly, you know, there was no more state-provided childcare services. So I think that just underscores the importance, particularly in an urban economy, in a very formalized urban economies of the industrial world, the importance of having the state finance childcare. The state does not have to provide childcare, but, you know, it needs to finance or subsidize the provision of childcare. I just wanted to mention on the violence and the sort of, on the other hand, you know, apps and, well, mobile technology more generally can reach women, you know, victims of violence and potential victims of violence with information and communication messages and help messages. So that, I mean, it has a negative, you know, impact on the one hand, but on the other hand, it has really a positive. And if you can sort of target, and there's a really, I'm going to just also promote. I work part-time at the UN Foundation for Data 2X, that is a project on gender data. And we have just published a report on the use of big data for gender, for filling gender data gaps. And one of the studies is a really interesting study that tries to identify the mental health of adolescent girls versus boys using Facebook and other real-time information technologies. And you know, it's really interesting how you can identify, because they're very good mechanisms to identify in real-time emotional states. And then hopefully, you know, you could pair that with some messages and asking, you know, and information about where these people can go and seek help in real time. So anyway, I thought
Can I
that
just
was.
come in on violence quickly as well, because this is something that came up perhaps predictably in our study, given that the domestic work sector is characterised in many ways by the exploitation and violence experienced by domestic workers who are in very hidden environments in households. And we also heard, both from some of the app companies we spoke to and some of the workers, that yes, you know, many of these things were still happening, that the workers were still experiencing different kinds of violence whilst in households. But there was a great potential of the technology that we found that could be employed to start to counter some of these things. So for example, we found, not it has to be said in relation to on-demand work apps, but for example in India we know of apps where in terms of women's mobility who've experienced violence, if people are in a kind of crisis, a violent situation, there's a panic button on their phone, which has also been done in very low-tech phones. It doesn't just require a smartphone, where they can press. It's not necessarily a crucial point calling out to the police, because sometimes the authorities aren't necessarily going to respond quickly enough, but what it did was send a GPS coordinate to a couple of pre-programmed numbers to say where the user was. Now, in the case of something like the gig economy, where workers from day to night don't necessarily know where they're going to be working, in any case they're in homes, something like that was built into the platform technology could be really, you know, quite positive for the workers who, if they're in a crisis situation, could activate this kind of a mechanism. You know, and there's a great number of areas of promise that could be built in, but the crucial thing is this relies on the companies being willing to do so, and we've not seen that much evidence so far that the companies are willing to do that. Same again with data. You know, the anonymity of perpetrators on many forms of technology is there. Again, for the platform technology that we've been looking at, these things are a data trove. For the first time, women aren't going into unknown contexts, sometimes with unknown people, because they've had to register for certain details with the site to even be there. So actually, if it was set up properly in a way that that some level of information about the household was there, that could really help with accountability and identification and supporting workers to feel they could come forward about cases of violence. But it's a long way off, because at the moment the companies feel that there would be too much resistance from the purchasers to integrate those kind of functions.
That's interesting. I actually wanted to add a note before I take the next question. China's example and experience on care is very interesting. So a lot of the boom was supported by state-sponsored care, which in recent years has been taken away, and that's had an impact on the women's share of work. And again, as implication for as the economy matures and the older population increases, because while initially it was about childcare, caregiving proportion still goes up, but the state-sponsored portion of that has gone down, and that has had an effect. So again, it's an interesting backward-looking example that can be quite useful for us when we look at conversations on cutting state services or state financing of certain responsibilities. We will now go to another round. Questions?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Sarah Hodson, and I work in mobile health primarily, so I'm coming more from apps for community health workers and different programs that are delivering services in really rural areas. And so I'm curious if any of your research has covered, you know, state-sponsored technology access, NGOs kind of pushing technology as that first point of access for a lot of really rural women to actually get a phone in their hand for the first time for their job. And you know, in our programs, we work with a lot of different groups that are procuring the technology, and so naturally it's not really sustainable. It might be that that technology is only for that one job, like you're doing prenatal visits in a village, and so your app is really designed just for that one vertical. And so it's quite limiting, but I was just wondering if your research has seen externalities of what like global health technology kind of pushes in the last 5 years has done for individuals. Has it sparked, ripple effects of technology access in really rural areas? And I had kind of a separate question that I felt impossible to not address, that seemed kind of like an elephant in the room, that we have about 90% women in this room. And this topic itself, everything you're talking about is near and dear to me. It feels like common sense for everything that's happening in the world, that when you're watching these trends are impacting so many women. But as leaders in that field, how do you communicate about what you do when you're kind of advocating at the policy level and with different groups and different governments to make this not a women's issue? And I don't want it to be, but kind of looking around, like a lot of us are women, so we're all here for, I'm sure, some of that connection, but it's so much bigger than that. So that's just a personal struggle.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Fenois Namaré, and I'm a senior research associate here at the Urban Institute. My question is for Myra. Thank you, everyone, for all your contributions. It was very interesting to listen to your inputs. My question is for Myra on the smart design and the savings. It doesn't come. If you advise a country that savings is really the solution and that would increase its autonomy, and that's what we aim for, I think there are so many steps that for a country to get there for women. So have you experienced intervention activities in a particular country that really worked, that you can share maybe? Because I'm working in Tanzania and I'm sort of the gender person, and I have to come up with, if I have a policy that I say, I have to really think of what implementation activities should I put in, to work with the government, to work at the local level, and this and that. So we have to be concrete in what we advise in terms of policy. Yeah.
So it seems that better information for policymaking is very much the theme of this round. I have two questions from the online audience which ask about that. So in one, it's how can technology help provide better information for policymaking that incentivizes this change? Your question about how do we communicate this to others or change makers. And the same for those in finance and planning ministries. So about not just how we communicate, but who we communicate to, and what are the lessons on that. Before I open up, though, I wanted to directly address your question around state-sponsored access of, I know particularly, not necessarily for health, but cash transfers, and again, the example of Pakistan, just because of the scale, the National Cash Transfer Program gives low-cost mobile phones to women who receive the cash transfers. Again, the cash transfers are extremely low, and the cost of the mobile phone is also extremely low, so it actually works out. But once women get the mobile phones, these are not smartphones, these are very basic phones. The principle of that is just that they know when the money is coming there. But the government and the whole cash transfer program is trying to expand that so they can send notifications to the phone, either savings notifications, health updates, vaccinations. This is very promising. I think it's definitely worth looking into how far that's gone, but that's one large-scale example that I definitely know about. But I will, again, turn this set of questions to our panelists. Perhaps they have more interesting examples on this and around the policy-making questions, both how and who we communicate with.
So let me just answer very briefly the question on mobile savings. I mean, I believe there are no silver bullets in this area, particularly of women's economic empowerment. But if there is one, close, could be savings just because of the evidence. When we wrote the roadmap in 2013, there were like two really rigorous studies, one in the Philippines and one in Kenya, that showed that it's women's preference for savings rather than credit. And then they use those savings when they have access to individual savings, they use it for business purposes. I'm not talking about mobile savings. I'm just talking about savings with some kind of commitment device perhaps, but individual savings. Now, 3 years later, we have many more countries with similar evidence. So, it tells you something, but we still have to test and see, we believe that if savings is an instrument that women prefer to use. There are certain things about savings that they really like. We believe that maybe mobile savings can really help them, right? Because it It overcomes a lot of the transaction costs that women have to accessing a bank, going to a bank. But we are testing that. I mean, there's just now a study that came out that is the first study that was published in Science magazine that shows that mobile savings really has an effect. But we are testing one actually in Tanzania and one in Indonesia on mobile savings to see the effects. So that, can I answer a bit the question? I think it's a real issue. And I'm happy that you brought it up because it happens all the time. You know, these are the kinds of things. Women come to, and very few men come to listen to issues of development of women. What is really sort of pitiful and painful is that women's issues illuminate development issues. They really provide an insight that is very particular and that it helps understand and helps to plan for better development. And the opposite is also true. So, you know, you cannot separate women's issues from development issues. And this is, you know, in violence. I mean, I used to work on violence interventions and violence reduction. I always hated to see that violence against women, the violence against women community is completely separate from that other community that is trying to reduce violence in the cities. And it's completely nonsensical. I mean, because there are certain interventions that you're doing for prevention of overall violence that are incredibly important for women, like lights in the streets, street lightings, community policing, whatever. So, but there's certain things, you know, looking at development through the gender lens really adds value. And that, I think, is sort of the message that we have to bring to the development community, not only finance ministers. And hopefully, you know, that will make a difference. But maybe not in my time.
Yasmin.
Yeah, I want to kind of add to what you were saying. Like, it's not going to be just coming from my work on violence against women, but I'm also doing work on gun violence. It's like it's the same rhetoric where when you focus on the issue from only the victimization perspective, you're basically missing out a different type of stakeholder group out there. Like we already have made so much progress to make the connections between why we need to care about women's economic empowerment because it's related to economic growth. And the thing is, like, when we are talking about, again, the violence against women issue, we should be kind of change that rhetoric and make it, like, move it to a public health issue, even more of a, you know, local public health issue. So this violence against women, for instance, in public spaces, what does it mean at the neighborhood level or at the community level for the businesses out there and stuff? And the reason I'm saying is that when you were saying that, what does the states do with regards to bringing that technology to the people? It's not just going to be the governments that's going to be bringing that technology. Like, we should start thinking about how can you make also businesses, private organizations be more involved in investing in, you know, providing technology to people. So there's this social enterprise perspective to it, and I think we can, if we continue talking about why it matters at the community level as a public health issue, I think that might be a very key thing to.
In fact, if I may jump in there, one of the interesting things about the Pakistan example was mobile phone banking is taking off at the same time in a big way, and companies were very interested all of a sudden in contributing or being part of this conversation, because all of a sudden, because of this, you could have a very low-cost maintenance accounts in the hands of millions of people, and so they were very happy to help bankroll some of this because it increased economic activity and participation. So for them, it made commercial or access, as you say, really interesting. So it was a nice serendipity, or how that worked, that there was a complementarity there for private interest as well as state-sponsored interest. That doesn't always happen, but interesting. Abigail, I know ODI in particular has some really good lessons around engaging policymakers, both the mechanics and how and who. would be interesting to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I can only concur with what we've heard before. I think approaches need to be more cross-cutting, moving out of just kind of single-issue lenses. From the example of our own work, if we're thinking about the rise of the gig economy or these kind of technology-mediated ways of accessing work, the evidence points globally, in fact, that this, although it may not be the most predominant way now, all the evidence suggests that this is in the future going to become even more deeply embedded. So then for many governments, it's a question in a times of wanting to increase particularly women's access to work, around questions around women's equality and wider kind of economic growth questions. It's about, in some cases, it's about how do we support the use of the technology. So whether it's through women's increased access to mobile technology, whether it's through the infrastructure, whether it's about increasing affordability of internet access so that people can stay connected. And that's one way of looking at it. That's saying, okay, you know, how do we increase the access to the technology? And that's a policy response. But at the same time, what the gig economy has done is locate themselves very firmly in a technology and innovation space. So for example, what the companies have done, and it's the same with Uber, it's the same with many of these companies, they've set themselves up as very clearly, and it says in the terms and conditions, we are technology companies who facilitate through we provide the technology, we perform the platform, we provide the platform. The relationship is what was previously in many cases an employer-employee relationship is now a service provider and service purchaser. It's a commercial exchange. It's no longer an employment relationship. And in many cases, they go to great lengths, including paying a lot of money to legal companies to make sure that they themselves are not seen as an employer in any way, that they are facilitating a commercial exchange. Now, the challenge with that, when we're talking, as we heard earlier, about, you know, we need to make sure that work is accompanied by protections and various labour rights, and certainly not regressing where they have been established, is that the companies are going to great lengths to make sure that they are not subject to any kind of protections, which is leaving a lot of the workers very vulnerable. And many of the labour frameworks are frankly not fit for purpose. They've not yet responded to the new realities of these non-standard forms of employment. It's not just the gig economy, it's increased flexibilisation across many different labour market systems, which for me just goes to show that, you know, it's a labour issue, it's one for labour ministries, it's an economy issue, it's about how do we support this in terms of women's or people's access to economic opportunities. It's an infrastructure issue in terms of, right, okay, if this is happening, how do we make sure that everybody's able to benefit and that you're not left out of the opportunity because you don't have mobile access. So just to give a bit of a flavour of the fact that this is cross-cutting and requires an integrated policy response, notably, I might add, to make sure that these things evolve to the benefit of all, including those most at risk of currently being marginalised and left behind from the technology developments.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I'm going to have to close here. But I think, again, thank you very much. That was an excellent and fascinating conversation. I think going forward, that's something for all of us. Do we start with these are issues that affect women or gender-based issues and then try and segue into the mainstream, or in case of gaining access so that we're not siloed as women issues, do we start with, as you said, these are labor issues, economic growth issues, infrastructure issues, and having a gendered lens makes policy responses much, much more effective. So please, before we close, join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you very much for coming.